rain came down in sheets that October morning, hammering the tin roof of the Marlowe farmhouse like 1,000 angry fists. Thomas Marlowe stood at the kitchen window, his calloused hands gripping the chipped porcelain of the sink, watching the Cumberland River swell beyond its banks. The water moved thick and brown, carrying branches and debris downstream toward destinations unknown. Behind him, his wife Sarah moved quietly through the room, her footsteps barely audible over the storm. She carried their son, little James, wrapped in a worn quilt their grandmother had stitched decades before. The boy was 3 months old, with eyes as blue as a summer sky and hair the color of wheat. He made soft cooing sounds, oblivious to the tension that had settled over the household like fog over the hills. Thomas had not slept in 4 days. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his jaw was set in a way that made Sarah afraid to speak. She knew what weighed on him. She had known since the moment the midwife placed James in her arms and whispered the words that every Marlowe wife had heard for generations. A fine firstborn son. Those 4 words carried a death sentence in this family, a curse disguised as tradition. The Marlowe men gathered that afternoon in the front parlor, their boots tracking mud across the hardwood floors Sarah had scrubbed just the day before. Thomas's father, William, sat in the high-backed chair near the fireplace, his weathered face carved from the same unforgiving stone as the Appalachian peaks. Beside him stood Thomas's uncle, Robert, and his grandfather, Silas, who at 83 still moved with the rigid determination of a man half his age. They had come to remind Thomas of his duty, though no reminder was needed. The weight of it had pressed down on him since James drew his first breath. "Boy's 3 months now," William said, his voice rough as gravel. "River's high from the rain, good conditions." He spoke as if discussing the weather, as if they were planning to plant corn or mend a fence. Robert nodded in agreement, his arms crossed over his broad chest. "Done it myself, my firstborn, little William. Took him down at dawn. River was calm that day, like glass. He didn't suffer." The words hung in the air, heavy and obscene. Sarah, listening from the kitchen doorway with James pressed against her chest, felt her legs weaken. She gripped the doorframe, her knuckles white. Thomas turned from the window to face the men. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and steady. Why? It was a question no Marlowe had asked in over 100 years. The 3 older men exchanged glances, surprise flickering across their faces. Silas leaned forward in his chair, his gnarled hands resting on a wooden cane. "Because it's what we do, boy, what we've always done. Your great-great-grandfather started it, and every generation since has kept the pact." "What pact?" Thomas demanded. "With who? Why does the river need a child?" William stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "Don't question what you don't understand. The river provides for this family, always has. We've never gone hungry, never lost our land, never suffered the way others have. You see the Henderson farm down the road. Foreclosed last spring. The Pritchards lost 2 sons to the mines, the Cooper's daughter died of fever, but not us, never us." Thomas felt something crack inside him, a fissure in the foundation of everything he had been taught. "Maybe that's just luck. Maybe it's because we work hard, take care of what's ours." Robert laughed, a harsh bark of sound. "Luck? Boy, there's no such thing as luck in these hills. There's only what you're willing to pay for what you get." Sarah could remain silent no longer. She stepped into the parlor, James still in her arms. "You're talking about murdering a baby, your own blood. How can you stand there and call that anything but evil?" Silas's eyes, cold and grey as river stones, fixed on her. "Girl, you don't know what you're talking about. This family has survived hardships that would have broken others. We survived the war, the drought of 1890, the influenza. We survived because we keep our word." Thomas moved to stand beside his wife, his decision crystallizing in that moment. "Then I'm breaking it. James lives." The silence that followed Thomas's declaration was absolute. Even the rain seemed to pause, as if the storm itself held its breath. William's face darkened to the color of a bruise, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Robert took a step forward, but Silas raised one weathered hand, stopping him. The old man's eyes never left Thomas, studying him with an intensity that felt like physical weight. "You don't know what you're doing," Silas said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think you're saving him, but you're damning us all." Thomas stood his ground, though his heart hammered against his ribs. Then damn me. But not him. He's innocent. William moved toward his son, stopping inches from his face. You ungrateful fool. Everything you have, everything you are, exists because this family kept its word. The land beneath your feet, the roof over your head, the food on your table, all bought with sacrifice. Thomas met his father's gaze without flinching. Sacrifice is giving up something of your own, not someone else's life. The slap came fast, William's open palm connecting with Thomas's cheek with a crack that echoed through the room. Sarah gasped, pulling James tighter to her chest. Thomas's head snapped to the side, but he didn't move, didn't raise his hand in defense or retaliation. "Get out," William said, his voice shaking with rage. "Get out of this house. You're no son of mine." Robert and Silas moved toward the door, Robert's face twisted with disgust. But Silas paused at the threshold, turning back to look at Thomas one last time. "The river doesn't forget," he said quietly, "and it doesn't forgive." Then they were gone, their truck rumbling down the muddy driveway, leaving Thomas and Sarah alone with their son and their decision. That night, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with an old leather journal he had found in his father's study years before. It was his great-great-grandfather's diary, the handwriting cramped and faded but still legible. He had read it once as a teenager, more curious than believing. Now, he read it again with different eyes. Josiah Marlowe had written the first entry in 1832, newly arrived in Kentucky with his young wife and infant son. The entries spoke of failed crops, sickness, debt that mounted like storm clouds. Then, in the winter of 1833, everything changed. "Met a man by the river today," Josiah had written. "Strange fellow, didn't give a name. Said he knew the water, knew what it wanted. Said the river is hungry, always has been. Feeds on the land, on the trees, on whatever falls into its current. But what it wants most is promise. A promise kept, generation to generation. Give the river the first fruit of your line, and it will give you prosperity in return. I thought him mad, but we are starving and my wife grows weaker each day. What choice do I have?" The next entry was dated 2 weeks later. "It is done. Took my son, my firstborn, down to the water at dawn. The man was there waiting, said the words he told me to say, laid the boy in the current, watched him go under, did not look back. I am a monster, but we will survive." Thomas felt bile rise in his throat. The entries that followed documented Josiah's growing wealth. The crops came in abundant. Neighbors' farms failed while his thrived. He bought more land, built a bigger house. And when his second son was born, Josiah raised him to believe the sacrifice had been necessary, holy even. Sarah came to stand behind Thomas, her hand resting on his shoulder. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Thomas closed the journal, his jaw set with determination. "I'm going to find out where that river goes, find out what happened to all those boys." Thomas set out 3 days later, before dawn broke over the hills. He told Sarah he would follow the Cumberland downstream, stopping at every town, every settlement, asking questions that had never been asked. She packed him supplies, dried meat, cornbread, a canteen filled with well water. She also gave him a photograph of James, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the rain. "Find the truth," she whispered as he kissed her goodbye, "and come back to us." The first town was Burkesville, 20 miles south, where the river bent eastward through limestone cliffs. Thomas arrived as the morning mist lifted from the water, revealing a cluster of buildings huddled against the riverbank. He went first to the general store, where an elderly woman named Mrs. Hadley minded the counter. Her face was a map of wrinkles, her eyes sharp despite her age. Thomas bought tobacco he didn't smoke, making small talk before steering the conversation toward the river. "Been following the Cumberland," he said casually. "Heard stories about it, about families who made offerings." Mrs. Hadley's hands stilled on the jar she was wiping. Her eyes flicked to his face, searching. "You a Marlowe?" she asked. Thomas froze. "How did you know?" She set the jar down carefully, folding her hands on the counter. "Because you're not the first to come asking, and you won't be the last." She beckoned him to follow her to the back of the store, through a narrow doorway into a cramped office that smelled of dust and old paper. From a locked drawer, She pulled out a ledger, its pages yellowed with age. "My grandfather kept records," she said. "He was a doctor, delivered babies for most families in 3 counties. He noticed patterns. Marlowe firstborn sons never making it past a few months. Same with the Corbetts, the Bishops, the Henshaw family." Thomas stared at the names, his stomach churning. "There are others?" Mrs. Hadley nodded grimly. "At least 4 families that we know of. Maybe more. They all settled along the river around the same time, early 1800s. All made the same bargain." She turned the page, showing him columns of names and dates. Baby boys, all firstborns, all marked deceased within their first year. "But here's what my grandfather found interesting," she continued, pointing to a note scrawled in the margin. "None of the bodies were ever recovered. Not one." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. "What does that mean?" Mrs. Hadley closed the ledger, her expression troubled. "It means either they all drowned and the river kept them, or something else happened. Something those families don't want anyone knowing about." She studied Thomas for a long moment. "You have a son," she said. It wasn't a question. "I do. 3 months old." Mrs. Hadley nodded slowly. "Then you better keep moving downstream. There's a man in Salina, Tennessee, about 40 miles from here. Name's Pike. His family was like yours, made the same bargain, but he broke it 30 years ago. He might have answers." Thomas left Burkesville as the sun reached its peak, following the river road south. The landscape changed as he traveled, the hills giving way to gentler slopes, the trees thinning. He passed farms and small homesteads, each one struggling against the weight of the Depression. Men stood in fields with their hands in their pockets, staring at soil too dry to plant. Children played with toys made from sticks and string. The prosperity his family enjoyed stood in stark contrast to the poverty surrounding them. And for the first time Thomas understood the true cost of their wealth. He reached Salina as evening fell, the town quiet except for the sound of the river moving endlessly past. He found Pike in a small house on the outskirts, a man in his 60s with grey hair and a haunted expression. When Thomas introduced himself and explained why he had come, Pike invited him inside without hesitation, as if he had been expecting this conversation for decades. They sat at a worn kitchen table, a single lamp casting shadows on the walls. "I killed my father," Pike said without preamble, "the night he tried to take my son to the river. Didn't mean to. Just meant to stop him, but he fought me, and I hit him too hard." Pike's words hung in the air like smoke. Thomas sat across from him, trying to process what he had just heard. The older man's hands trembled slightly as he poured them both coffee from a dented pot, the liquid dark and bitter. Outside, the river murmured its endless song, indifferent to the confessions being made within the house's thin walls. "What happened after?" Thomas asked, his voice hoarse. Pike took a long sip of coffee before answering. "Buried him out back. Told everyone he left town. My mother knew the truth, but she never spoke it. She died hating me for what I did, but hating the tradition more. My son, Jacob, he's 30 now, lives in Nashville, got 2 daughters of his own. He doesn't know any of this. I never told him." Thomas leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "But did anything happen to you, to your family? The way they said it would if you broke the pact?" Pike's laugh was hollow, devoid of humor. "Depends on what you mean by anything. Crops failed the next 3 years. Lost most of the land to the bank. My wife left me, said I brought a curse down on us, spent 10 years drinking myself toward an early grave." He paused, staring into his coffee cup as if reading omens in the dark liquid. "But Jacob lived, and that was worth everything else." Thomas felt a mixture of fear and relief wash through him. So there were consequences, but nothing supernatural. Pike's eyes met his, and Thomas saw something in them that made his blood run cold. "I didn't say that. There were other things, strange things, dreams that felt too real, voices coming from the river at night. And once, I saw something in the water. A face looking up at me from beneath the surface, a child's face." He set his cup down with a trembling hand. "Could have been my imagination, guilt playing tricks, or could have been something else." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mrs. Hadley and Burkesville said the bodies were never recovered. Do you know why?" Pike nodded slowly. Because they weren't meant to be. My father told me before I stopped him that the children don't drown, they're taken. Downstream to a place where the river runs deepest, where it pools beneath an old bluff about 60 miles south of here. Called it the river's mouth. He stood, moving to a cluttered shelf on the far wall, pulling down a hand-drawn map. Here, he said, spreading it on the table. This is where they go. The map showed the Cumberland's winding path through Kentucky and Tennessee, with a spot circled in faded ink. Pike's finger tapped the circle. This bluff. My grandfather helped build a structure there, back in the 1850s, a stone building, half submerged in the water. Said it was for keeping them. Thomas felt his heart hammering. Keeping who? Pike's voice dropped to barely a whisper. The firstborns, all of them. They don't die, Thomas. They're kept alive down there, in the dark, in the water, fed to something older than the river itself. The room seemed to tilt. Thomas gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. That's impossible. A baby can't survive underwater, can't survive months or years without... Pike cut him off. You're thinking like a man who believes the world makes sense. But you and I both know there are things in these hills that don't follow natural law. Things our grandparents knew and tried to use for their own gain. He rolled up the map, pressing it into Thomas's hands. You want the truth? Go to the river's mouth, see for yourself, but I'll warn you, once you know, you can't unknow. And what you do with that knowledge could cost you everything. Thomas left Pike's house as midnight approached, the map heavy in his coat pocket. The river stretched before him, a ribbon of black beneath the starless sky. He thought of James, safe at home with Sarah, unaware of the darkness that had claimed so many before him. He thought of his father's rage, his grandfather's cold certainty, and he thought of Pike's words. They're kept alive down there. The idea was monstrous, impossible, yet it explained so much. The prosperity that never failed, the luck that seemed to follow the Marlowe name. It wasn't magic or divine favor. It was something far worse. He began walking downstream, following the river road through the night. He would not sleep, would not rest until he reached the river's mouth and saw the truth with his own eyes. Behind him, the town of Salina faded into darkness. Ahead, the river whispered its secrets, promising answers Thomas wasn't sure he wanted to find. But he would find them anyway, because James deserved a father who would face any horror to keep him safe, and because somewhere downstream, in the depths of that ancient water, other children waited in the dark. Thomas walked through the night, the river his only companion. The road was rough beneath his boots, muddy from recent rains, and the darkness pressed close on all sides. He passed through small settlements where lanterns flickered in windows, signs of life that felt distant and unreal. His mind churned with Pike's revelations, each word replaying like a broken record. They're kept alive down there. The thought was obscene, impossible, yet it explained the unnatural prosperity his family had enjoyed for generations. Blood money, bought with the suffering of innocent children. By dawn, he reached a crossroads where a weathered sign pointed toward Carthage. His legs ached, his stomach growled with hunger, but he pressed on. The map Pike had given him showed the river's mouth was still 30 miles downstream, past the town, past the last of the settlements. He bought coffee and bread at a roadside diner, where a tired waitress with kind eyes asked if he was traveling far. Far enough, he answered, not meeting her gaze. She didn't press, just refilled his cup and left him alone with his thoughts. The landscape changed as he continued south. The hills flattened into rolling terrain, and the river widened, its current slower but somehow more menacing. Thomas felt watched, though he saw no one. Birds fell silent as he passed. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath. By afternoon, he reached the spot marked on Pike's map. A dirt path led away from the main road, winding through dense forest toward the river. He followed it, branches catching at his coat, roots threatening to trip him with every step. The river's mouth revealed itself gradually. First, he heard it, a strange sound like breathing, a rhythmic inhalation and exhalation of water against stone. Then he saw it, a natural pool where the river widened into a basin, surrounded by steep bluffs that blocked the sunlight. The water here was darker than anywhere upstream, almost black, and unnaturally still despite the current feeding into it. And there, half submerged at the pool's edge, stood the structure Pike had described. A stone building, ancient and crumbling, its walls covered in moss and algae. Steps led down from the shore into the water, disappearing beneath the surface. Thomas stood on the bank, his heart hammering. The air felt wrong here, thick and heavy, charged with something he couldn't name. He called out, his voice echoing off the bluffs. "Hello, is anyone here?" Only silence answered. He moved closer to the structure, his boots squelching in the mud. The stones were carved with symbols he didn't recognize, spirals and geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in too many dimensions at once. He descended the steps slowly, the water rising to his ankles, then his knees. The cold bit through his trousers, numbing his legs. At the fifth step, he saw the entrance, a doorway leading into darkness beneath the water's surface. His breath came in short gasps. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to run, to forget what he had learned. But James's face filled his mind, innocent and trusting, and Thomas forced himself forward. He took a deep breath and submerged. The passage sloped downward, deeper than seemed possible. Thomas's lungs burned, his vision blurring at the edges. Just when he thought he would drown, the tunnel opened into an air pocket, a chamber carved into the rock beneath the riverbed. He surfaced, gasping, pulling himself onto a stone ledge. Emergency lighting filtered down from somewhere above, pale and green, revealing the chamber's full horror. Cages lined the walls, dozens of them, fashioned from iron and stone, and in those cages, moving in the dim light, were children. They ranged in age from infants to teenagers, their skin pale and translucent from years without sunlight. They moved slowly, dreamlike, their eyes reflecting the green light like animals. They wore rags, torn remnants of clothing from different eras, some from the 1930s, others older, much older. Thomas's stomach heaved. He approached the nearest cage, where a boy of perhaps 10 years sat motionless. "Can you hear me?" Thomas whispered. The boy's head turned slowly, and Thomas saw his eyes were completely white. No pupils, no iris, just blank whiteness. "The river keeps us," the boy said, his voice hollow. "The river feeds on us, and we feed it in return." Thomas recoiled from the cage, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The children, if they could still be called children, watched him with those terrible white eyes. Some pressed against the bars of their cages, reaching toward him with fingers that seemed too long, joints bending at wrong angles. Others sat motionless, their heads tilted at uncomfortable angles, as if listening to sounds Thomas couldn't hear. The chamber stank of river water and something else, something organic and rotting that made his throat close. "How long have you been here?" Thomas asked the boy, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. The boy's head tilted, considering. "Time moves different here. I remember my father's face, Josiah Marlowe. He promised I would sleep, that I wouldn't feel anything, but I felt everything. I still feel everything." Thomas felt his legs give out. He sank to his knees on the wet stone. This child was his great-great-grandfather's son, the first sacrifice that started the tradition. Over 100 years old, trapped in this nightmare, neither fully alive nor truly dead. Another voice spoke, this one from across the chamber. A girl, slightly older, her hair hanging in wet tangles around her face. "They bring us here, and the river takes us slowly, drains us, uses what we are to feed the families above. Our life force, our potential, everything we might have been, it flows upstream to them." She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "They prosper while we exist in this half-life, suspended between worlds. The river is ancient, older than humanity. It learned to feed on us, and our ancestors learned to bargain with it." Thomas forced himself to stand to look at all of them. He counted 15 cages, 15 children from different generations of his family and others. Some were mere infants, lying still in their cages, breathing but never crying. Others were teenagers, their bodies grotesquely elongated from years of improper growth in captivity. "Is there a way to free you?" he asked desperately. "Can I break the cages, get you out?" The first boy shook his head slowly. "We are bound to the river now. Its water flows through our veins. Take us from here, and we would dissolve like salt in rain." A horrifying realization struck Thomas. Then there's no way to end this, to stop the cycle. The girl spoke again, her white eyes fixing on him with disturbing precision. "There is one way. Starve the river, stop feeding it. The bargain requires constant sacrifice to maintain. Miss even one generation, and the connection weakens. Miss two, and it breaks entirely. The prosperity ends, but so does the horror. We would finally be allowed to die properly, to be released into whatever comes after this existence." Thomas thought of his family, of the wealth and health they enjoyed while these children suffered. He thought of his father's rage, his grandfather's cold certainty, all of them willingly participating in this atrocity generation after generation. And he thought of James, safe at home, unaware that he was meant to join this nightmare. The choice crystallized in his mind with absolute clarity. "I won't let them take my son," he said firmly. "The bargain ends with me." The children stirred in their cages, a ripple of movement passing through them. "Then prepare yourself," the boy said. "The river will fight back. It has fed on our families for over a century. It won't release that claim easily." As if in response to his words, the water level in the chamber began to rise. Thomas felt it lapping at his ankles, cold and purposeful. The green light flickered and he heard something moving in the passages beyond the chamber, a sound like water flowing in reverse, like suction pulling at the foundations of the world. "Go now," the girl urged, "before it traps you here too. Tell your son what you found. Make sure he knows the truth." Thomas backed toward the passage he had entered through, his eyes on the children. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry this happened to you." The boy's expression didn't change. "We know. Now go and make sure we were the last." Thomas dove into the passage, swimming frantically back toward the surface, the water pulling at him like hands, trying to drag him down. He kicked harder, his lungs screaming, and burst from the river's mouth into the dying afternoon light. Thomas lay on the muddy bank, coughing up river water, his body shaking from cold and shock. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed obscene after the horror he had just witnessed. He forced himself to his feet, his clothes soaked, his mind reeling. The children's white eyes haunted him, their hollow voices echoing in his memory. He had to get home, had to warn Sarah, had to protect James from the family that would surely come for him once they learned Thomas had refused to fulfill the bargain. The walk back took 2 days. Thomas moved in a daze, stopping only when exhaustion forced him to collapse at the roadside. He ate nothing, drank only from streams far from the Cumberland. The river felt contaminated now, poisoned by the knowledge of what fed its depths. Other travelers gave him wide berth, perhaps sensing the trauma that clung to him like a shroud. On the second night, camped in a grove of hickory trees, Thomas dreamed of drowning, of white eyes watching him from beneath dark water, of hands pulling him down into a green-lit abyss from which there was no escape. He reached home at dawn on the third day, stumbling up the drive to find Sarah waiting on the porch, James in her arms. She took one look at his face and understood that everything had changed. She brought him inside, drew him a bath, burned his river-soaked clothes. While he cleaned himself, she prepared food he couldn't eat, and coffee he drank mechanically, tasting nothing. Finally, when James was sleeping in his crib, Thomas told her everything. The chamber beneath the river, the caged children, the bargain that had sustained their family's prosperity for over a century. Sarah wept silently, her hand covering her mouth. When Thomas finished, she looked at him with eyes full of determination. "We leave tonight. Take James, take whatever we can carry, and disappear. Change our names. Start over somewhere your family can't find us." Thomas nodded. It was the only way. But even as they began to pack, gathering clothes and food and what little money they had saved, he felt the wrongness creeping back. The air in the house felt heavy, oppressive. The temperature dropped, though the fire still burned in the hearth. And outside, through the kitchen window, he saw the river rising. It shouldn't have been possible. The Cumberland was miles from their house, separated by hills and forest. But Thomas watched as water crept up the drive, flowing in defiance of gravity, pooling around the foundation. Sarah saw it too and grabbed James from his crib. the baby waking with a cry. "The cellar," Thomas said. "Get to high ground. I'll hold them off." But even as he spoke, he knew there was no holding off something like this. The river had been feeding on his family for generations. It wouldn't release its claim without a fight. The front door burst open, though Thomas had locked it. Water poured in, carrying the smell of decay and river mud. And with it came his father, his uncle, his grandfather, but wrong somehow. Their eyes held that same white blankness he had seen in the caged children, and they moved with unnatural fluidity, as if their bones had been replaced with water. "You broke the bargain," William said, his voice layered with something else, something ancient that spoke through him. "You went to the river's mouth. You saw what you were never meant to see." Thomas pushed Sarah toward the back door. "Run. Don't look back. Get James somewhere safe." She hesitated, torn between fleeing and staying with him. "Thomas," he cut her off. "Go, I'll find you, I promise." She fled into the night with James clutched to her chest. Thomas turned to face his father and the thing that wore his father's face. "You're not him," Thomas said quietly. "You're the river, aren't you? The thing that's been feeding on us all this time." The smile that crossed William's face was not human. "We are both. We are the bargain made flesh, and you will honor it or lose everything." Thomas stood his ground as the water rose around his ankles, the things wearing his family's faces advancing slowly. "I've already lost everything," he said. "My family's honor, my heritage, the belief that we were good people, all of it built on the suffering of children. I won't add my son to that foundation." The William thing tilted its head, and Thomas saw water leaking from its eyes like tears. "You think you can simply walk away? The river gave your family everything. Your land, your health, your prosperity through depression and drought. That debt must be paid." Thomas felt rage building in his chest, burning away the fear. "Debt? Those children owed nothing. They were innocent." "Hewitt, whatever the hell you are, you twisted my ancestors into monsters. You made them believe sacrifice was necessary, that prosperity justified murder." He grabbed a kerosene lamp from the table, his hand steady despite the insanity surrounding him. "But it ends tonight. I'll burn this whole house down before I let you take my son." The creatures paused, some calculation passing between them. When the William thing spoke again, its voice had changed, becoming multiple voices speaking in unison. Old voices, young voices, the voices of all the children trapped beneath the river. "You would destroy the legacy your family built, return to poverty, to struggle, to the hardships that plague everyone else in these dying hills." Thomas smiled grimly. In a heartbeat. "I'd rather starve with my soul intact than prosper on stolen life." He smashed the lamp against the floor. Kerosene spread across the water, and he struck a match. The flames caught instantly, racing across the surface, climbing the walls. The creatures shrieked, a sound like rushing water and breaking ice, and retreated through the open door. Thomas followed them out, watching as they dissolved into mist, returning to the river from which they had been shaped. The water that had flowed up from the Cumberland receded, pulling back, leaving only mud and dying grass behind. The farmhouse burned through the night, a beacon visible for miles. Thomas stood in the yard watching generations of Marlowe history reduced to ash and memory. When the roof collapsed with a shower of sparks, he felt something break inside him, not despair but release. The weight he had carried since James's birth, the weight every Marlowe man had carried, lifted. He was free. His son was free. The bargain was broken. He found Sarah and James 3 miles away, sheltering in an abandoned barn. Sarah ran to him, and they held each other while James slept peacefully between them, unaware that his father had just burned their past to save his future. "What now?" Sarah asked. Thomas looked toward the east, where dawn was beginning to paint the sky. "Now we go west. California, maybe, somewhere far from this river, far from this family. We start over with nothing but ourselves." They left Kentucky that morning, 3 people in an old truck with everything they owned packed in the bed. As they drove, Thomas looked in the rearview mirror one last time. In the distance, smoke still rose from where the Marlowe farmhouse had stood, and beyond it, barely visible through the morning mist, the Cumberland River flowed on, eternal and patient, waiting for the next desperate family to make the next terrible bargain. But the Marlowe line's debt was paid. The children in their underwater cages would finally be released to whatever peace death could offer them. And James would grow up free from the curse that had claimed so many before him. Thomas pressed the accelerator, and the river fell away behind them, growing smaller and smaller until it was nothing but memory, nothing but a story he would someday tell his son as a warning. Some prices are too high to pay, some traditions too dark to honor, and breaking free sometimes means burning down everything you thought you knew. The road ahead was uncertain, empty of promises and guarantees, but it was theirs, and that was enough. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.